Today I'm speaking with Tamim Ansary, a prolific author and a wealth of information and perspective. I first became familiar with Tamim's work after reading Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes, which quickly became one of my favorite pieces of historical nonfiction, if not one of my favorite books of all time. We spoke about a number of topics included in this book, as well as one of his more recent publications titled The Invention of Yesterday. It was a great pleasure and an honor to get the chance to speak with him, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. So without further ado, Tamim Ansary. Okay, so, of course I'm familiar with your background. That's the origin of me reaching out to you. But just for any listeners who may not be quite as familiar with you, I think it'd be great if, in your own words, you could just detail a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I was born in Afghanistan. My father was an Afghan guy. He was sent to the States, one of the first Afghans to be sent by the government to study in the West. He married my mother in Chicago and brought her back. And so I grew up there, and then I came to America when I was 16. Been here ever since. I don't know. Everything I write, in some way, has to do with the overlap between cultures and civilizations, and I think it goes back to the fact that my psyche and identity is a place where cultures and civilizations have overlapped. So
Sure.
I'm obsessed with those issues.
Yeah. So again, I know you're more focused on the invention of yesterday, and I don't have too many questions specifically about Destiny Disrupted, but it's sort of broadly all set up around the Middle East, Afghanistan, a lot of more broad issues. So one of the only specific questions I had in relation to Destiny Disrupted is, in the beginning of the book, you introduced sort of the motivation for writing it. Yeah. Just as being taken aback by how little time was spent uncovering so many different civilizations and cultures, and namely the Islamic world, while you were working as a textbook writer and editor. So I wanted to start with sort of a big, broad question, which is, why do you think it is important to be familiar with these topics and to have people educated on the Islamic world and many of the cultures and civilizations that don't really get the time of day that they arguably should?
Well, let me back up from that a little bit and state in a different way what the impulse was that got me writing Destiny Disrupted. And it isn't specifically about the Islamic world, although the issue for me went back to around 9/11, a time when all of a sudden it seemed, the Western world said, "What the hell is this Islam thing?" And what I was interested in there was that this Islam thing was not a historical topic that was part of the medieval world. It's like in my textbook editing experience, world history educators in in the mainstream of American high school education about the history of the world, the Islamic world was something that happened in medieval times, and it was lumped in with pre-Columbian America and ancient empires of Africa. And I'm looking at the map and I'm saying, oh, but it still exists and it's huge. But there was another thing that caught my attention, and this was right around that time. I was reading Islamic history because that's what I'm interested in, or was at that time. And what I noticed was that there was a curious parallelism between the history of the world as it looked when one thought of the center of the world being Europe, and when you looked at Europe, you said, okay, back in the ancient times there was this great empire, and then the barbarians came down from the north and the empire fragmented, and then the Christianity came in and it became these Christian Germanic kingdoms. And I'm going, you know what, if you take away the specifics, that story would also be the narrative of world history, if you assume that the center of the world and the capital of history is that area between, let's say, the Indus River and Istanbul. So you're talking about the Islamic heartland. And if you're there and you look back, you go, oh yeah, there was this ancient, universal empire. It wasn't Rome, it was the Caliphate. And then you go, but then what happened to the Caliphate? The barbarians came, no, the nomads came down from the north. They weren't the Germans, they were the Turks in this case. And then what happened? Christian kingdoms? No, it was like these Islamic kingdoms. Small Islamic kingdoms replaced this one universal empire. And what struck me about that was that one's sense of what is the history of the world depends on where one is and where one is situated and where one thinks uh, everything revolves around. So Destiny Disrupted was in part an attempt to sort of illustrate this thesis that there is not the history of the world. What there are world historical narratives, which are narratives that are somebody centric inherently. Usually they're not the we that is at the center of the story doesn't identify itself because it's taken for granted, but really a history of the world is the story of how we got to where we are today. And then if you look at that closely, you say, wait a minute, who's the we here? The we isn't everybody, it's somebody. And if you take a different somebody, then they have a different idea of the history of the world. When I went out and toured Destiny Disrupted, one of the questions I heard once was, well, how can you prove yours is the real history of the world? And I'm like, no, that's missing the point.
Yeah.
There is no real history of the world. This is that's not to say that when you're putting together a history, you should not be concerned about the accuracy of the facts of which your history is constructed. But the accuracy of the facts is a different thing than the narrative which you've constructed out of those facts. It's, the facts of history are like the bricks, and then the narrative of history is like something you've built with those bricks. Might be a cathedral, might be a railway station, it might be an outhouse. Same. If the bricks are no good, whatever it is will fall down. So the bricks have to be good.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like the work on with Destiny Disrupted led very naturally into what you're focused on today with the invention of yesterday and everything, right? Because the ideas that you're focusing on in the invention of yesterday are sort of, as you just explained, an extension of what you were trying to show through Destiny Disrupted, correct?
Exactly. And what I thought about it as an extension after I was, after I'd been discussing Destiny Disrupted, I went two different ways actually with that. The book I wrote after Destiny Disrupted was called Games Without Rules, a history of Afghanistan. Hardly anybody's read it. It's like for some reason nobody was interested because it came out right at that period when, I tell you, Americans did not want to hear about Afghanistan. This was 2012.
Yeah.
And it was like the war nobody wanted to hear about.
I'm surprised. Yeah, I'm surprised at that because you would think that the relevance of Afghanistan would just drive people to take an interest and try to make sense for themselves what's going on. It seems I would expect the exact opposite sort of trend.
That's what I thought too. So I wrote it, and it was going to come out in 2012, and there was a presidential election that year. And I'm an old guy, so I remember the Vietnam days. We're at war someplace, and that would be an issue. In that election season, it was I guess McCain and who was it in 2012? I forget.
I guess yeah,
Obama
McCain
versus
and Obama.
Romney,
Yeah,
I guess. Yeah, that's who it was.
yeah.
But whoever it was, Afghanistan was only mentioned one time, and it wasn't by either candidate. It never came up in the debates. I think it was Clint Eastwood talking to an empty chair, and some.
Of course.
And but I went two different ways from Destiny Disrupted. Afghanistan, the Afghanistan book was kind of like a case study of what I was talking about in Destiny Disrupted. Afghanistan. If you're inside Afghanistan, there's a story. And in this story, these outside powers are this thing you have to deal with. They're there and they come in, but they're not what the story is about. The story is about the struggle that's going on in the country between the modernists and the, go back to the past, people,
Hmm.
and that becomes a struggle between the city and the rural, culture. And I got to tell you, I was talking about Afghanistan in 2012, but I could be writing that book now about America.
Hmm.
So I went that way, and people ignored it, and then Afghanistan, what happened there happened. But after around that time, I was also becoming aware that I went to Afghanistan in 2012,
Hmm.
and and I had been there. The last time I'd been there was in 2002, and the country had been, my old neighborhoods that I grew up in were just rubble. They looked like the firebombing of Dresden, if you've seen pictures of that, or
Hmm.
you know, it just seemed like. But the old Afghanistan was somehow still there in terms of like the feeling of it, the
Hmm.
atmosphere, the social
Yeah.
interrelationships among people. The fact that we could go to some river 20 miles outside the city and just sit on this by these riverbanks. And in about 20 minutes, there's like 20 people just gathered with us, and they've brought mulberries they've plucked from the nearest trees, and we spend like 3 hours, and everybody's telling stories, and stories are mostly lies. Nobody
Yeah, that's what makes them fun, I suppose, at the same
cares.
time,
Yeah,
right?
and so in 2002 it was like that. I went back in 2012, and the the you know Kabul felt like it was one of those world cities. It was like Paris. It was like um, New York. When you go to these cities, you're in a culture that's kind of the same in all of them. There are
Hmm.
different versions of global culture, and Kabul was one of those. You come into the airport and you just feel all of the cultural breezes from every place is going through. And I wanted to find rural Afghanistan. I
Hmm.
wanted to find that place that was untouched by. And we drove to central Afghanistan, to Bamyan, where those Buddhas
Hmm. Hmm.
had been destroyed. Uh, Fabulous place, boy! I hadn't been there since I was 2 years old and didn't remember the 2 year old visit.
Yeah.
Uh, the Buddhas are gone, but man, that place is still permeated by something. And
Yeah.
then we got in a car, and people said, "Well, let's go to Banyamid, which are these lakes." So we went to Banyamid, and then they said, "Let's go to the scale of the dragons." And there's this rock where there's this crack, and you can hear rumbling in there. So we headed there. There was no road at this point. It's like there was a faint track in the desert, and I look up and I see one of these little mud villages clinging to the hillside there, and I see a little white, little gleaming thing, and I get binoculars. What's that? And I look, and it's like I guess it was a satellite dish,
Hmm.
and I'm
Wow.
going, man, we're a satellite dish.
Yeah.
How do they operate that thing? They said, well, they have solar panels, and they buy them, from Kabul or wherever. Um, Well, how do they buy them? Well, they have opium, and opium is the currency, and then they take that to Tajikistan, and it's processed, goes to Albania. And I'm like, wait, so how do they even get that to? They have motorcycles. Motorcycles are made specifically both in Iran and China to serve this market. They're cheap enough for these guys,
Wow.
and that's how they get up and down. Well, what do they watch in this town? What can they get? Well, they can get lots of television stations now in Kabul. For example, uh, Kabul Star or Afghan Star. I guess. What is Afghan Star? It's a singing competition that was based on American Idol, which itself
Wow.
was based on a show that began in Britain,
Hmm.
British Pop Idol or something.
Something like
Uh,
that. Yeah.
and I'm going, wait, China supplies motorcycles, so these guys can go get solar panels with money they get from trade that goes to Albania and then Western Europe to watch this show that that imitates something in Britain. And then I read that most of the 80% of the kids' toys in America are made by China. I'm going, you know what? There's something here we should be talking about. By the time I published The Invention of Yesterday, it wasn't this thing I saw out there. It was like this thing that was already in the
Yeah.
rear view mirror. But, you know, I saw that what was happening was that, when I was growing up, everybody lived in a world that was not the whole world. Everybody lived in a world that what they knew, the framework they lived in was in some sense local. And there were other worlds out there. But technology has done some, has produced a situation in which anybody can send a message to anybody else anywhere on earth instantly. So there's that. But what is not the case is that that message has the same meaning for the two people because everybody still lives in a context. So I wanted to I wanted to write a book that would begin to uh, plow the ground for finding that narrative that could be the narrative of a global culture. What we have now are narratives that are not the global culture. It's us guys, and there's a lot of them guys out there.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's so clamorous, the us guys groups are getting smaller and smaller everywhere. It's like I find that whatever culture I feel myself to be a part of, there's within that subcultures that, man, they sure don't feel like us guys.
Yeah,
There's
sure.
the social bubble thing is such a prominent feature of. Uh, so I wanted to write a book that looked at the story of humankind from a global sort of perspective, from the how did we get to where we are today, still that question, but assuming that the we now is this intertangled spaghetti of lives
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like is enveloping the planet.
Sure.
Um, so that's what I'm not saying Invention of Yesterday is the story. Let's all know that story comes out of conversation. So I'm trying to start that conversation. What is the story of all of us?
Sure, absolutely. Do you see the development towards one global culture to be a positive thing or a negative thing? I mean, I'm sure the answer is somewhere in the middle. Like you said, you're sort of implicitly subjugating a lot of the subgroups that lose themselves as we develop towards a global culture. But at the same time, I suppose you could argue that there's a lot to benefit from that as well.
Well, I I don't look at it as someplace in the middle. I
Hmm.
hate someplace in the middleism.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
you know, uh, but what I think is it is a it is the case that as a species, we humans now have so much power on Earth vis-a-vis the environment
Hmm.
uh, that the circumstance we used to face in most of our history no longer applies in a way. In most of our history, we were a bunch of humans, and there was things in the environment that were coming at us, and had to be ready for it. So we tried to figure out what's out there, what's coming, and what should we do? Are they friends? Are they foes? Are they other people? Is it a storm? Is it wild animals coming? What is it? We need spears. What do we need? Um, but now our power over the environment is such that anything we do to uh, to get ready for what might be coming out of the environment changes the environment because we control. The environment is
Yeah.
ourselves in a way. So
Hmm.
now uh, the things that we have to deal with in the near future involve all of us operating as if we were some single social organism. And so that's the reality. So we have to be that. Now, I find that lots of people shy away from this idea of global culture because because there's something warm about being with your own people.
Sure.
You know, I experience it when I go into my neighborhood down here, where I live in San Francisco, and there's this nice little street there, and there's shops that I know, and when I walk down that street, I might run into people I know, but what's also the case is that most of the people I see, pretty much everybody I see on the street, if I don't know them, there might be somebody I'll meet and become friends with one day. They're my kind of people. And that's the village. I live in a village. And I think everybody, the root experience of humankind was tribal. It's like clan, not even tribal, it's clanal.
Hmm.
That kind of sounds like an obscene word.
I see what you're getting at, though. Don't worry. Don't worry.
It's clan, but then at a later time it's village, and
Hmm.
there's something about the idea that a village is is a place where everybody isn't your family. There's different families in a village, but you're all in the village, and I think there's a homesickness for the village experience that we all kind of have, and that some of our uh, dissatisfactions with the democracy we're in is that we want the kind of democracy you can have in a village where your voice actually matters. Just you little person, your voice
Hmm.
actually matters. And there's everybody agrees about the universe. What is the universe all about?
Hmm.
Everybody kind of sees the same universe enough that you can at least talk about whatever comes up. And that's really hard when you're in a society that is at the very least 300 million people big,
Hmm.
you know, and within that 300 million, there is at least, 10,000, 20,000, who
Yeah.
knows, different kind of like people who have a sense of we are the people that, then there's those guys. I
Hmm.
don't know how many there are, it's like, it depends on how you uh, identify those kinds of groups. But uh, sometimes people say, well, ethnic groups, but that's not all of it.
Hmm.
There's
Sure.
like hipsters are a group, and urban people are a group, and woke people are a group, and church people are a group, and evangelic,
Absolutely.
family values. Well, different kind of ideologies see themselves as groups, and um, and it's how do you have a play how do you have a system where you can really get a sense of each person having a voice in what happens by having elections. It's like the elections are very distant from each person's voice. I
Hmm.
don't know how we're going to do that, but we're in the process of working this out, and I hope we don't. I hope we can do it peacefully.
Certainly, certainly. How do you imagine in general, though? I mean, again, I don't expect you to have a one size fits all solution for such a big problem, but do you envision it something that we learn to sort of adjust and quell that desire for feeling like we have a larger input and more of a local community, or is it something that we actually learn to instantiate in society and live in some sort of quasi smaller community within our broader communities?
I think we will eventually come up with some way in which we're all living in a quasi smaller community, but that we have a sufficiently global sense of the whole story that we're in, that our little small community can accept that they're part of the big story, even though we have our little story.
Yes.
Um, because that has happened. We're not incapable of doing that.
Hmm.
Uh, in a culture that's very, you know, that works very well, and it's a friendly culture where people are fine and they all get along. Um, there's still within that, people live in smaller subcultures, and within those subcultures, they live in smaller little like families or friendship groups that know each other. I think that's totally possible. It's just what we don't have is the narrative, the global narrative. Um, and and I, you know, now after Invention of Yesterday, I I I I delivered a set of lectures earlier this year. Someone uh, asked me to. Uh, well, I came up with a title. That's the lectures were called "The Invention of Tomorrow,"
I see. Yeah, I see.
and and what that led me to was really to think philosophically. You know, it's gotten me thinking about um, well, well, first about history. You know, because uh, I will say, although I've written two world histories and a history of Afghanistan, I don't think of myself as a historian. You know, I don't
Hmm.
teach history in a college, and I used to be a history editor in the textbook industry, but I don't think of myself as a historian because what I'm interested in, uh, you know, the things I've written are history and memoir. Those are the two genres that I've mostly written. Now I'm writing a novel. And what I see is that I'm always working on the same kind of thing. You know, a
Hmm.
memoir is just history writ small. Um, a memoir is what history looks like from real close.
Yeah.
And history is what memoir looks like when you take a whole bunch of memoirs and get far enough away to see how they interweave. And so, what I've been thinking about is uh, something like this. You know, the history that we know about in the past um, is actually a story that exists in the present. You know, we actually have no access to the past. We can't
Hmm.
see it, we can't touch it, we can't smell it. Uh, it is no more part of our experience than is, you know, Cinderella's castle or whatever.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just a
Absolutely.
story that exists in the present. And um, but in speaking philosophically, what has happened so far actually did happen. We don't know
Yeah.
what it was, but it actually did happen. There's nothing we can do about
Hmm.
that. The past is real. We just can't go there. The future, on the other hand, is not real.
Hmm.
Uh, Quantum physics is actually elaborating this idea. You know, it's saying
Hmm.
until it's observed, it doesn't, the wave function doesn't collapse.
Hmm.
And some philosophers say what that means is the future becomes real as it enters the present. And
Sure.
that's what the present is. So the present is this place where we have agency, and we can't visit the future. We can't visit the past. The only thing we know about the future is it's a coming,
Yeah. Exactly. And
and
it's uncertain. The only
and
certainty is the uncertainty.
yeah, but it's not completely uncertain because we're peering and we're trying to make out what is this thing coming, and we know that what we do right now is going to have some effect on what it is when it gets here.
Hmm.
It's not going to have complete effect. We don't have total control, but we have some agency here. And how can we tell what we should do then in that case? Um, you know, the metaphor that comes to me is like we're blindfolded mariners who can't even see our hands on the till, steering
Hmm.
a ship into darkness, but we can't see where we're going. But it's still the case that we're the ones steering.
Yeah. I like that analogy very much.
And since we can't see where we're going, we have to imagine where we're going. So the future is a place we're imagining, and what we have to imagine is a place we could actually get to from here. So we have to know what is here. What do we mean by here? What is here? That's where history comes in. You know,
Hmm.
that story-like aspect of history, the narrative we're putting together about the past from these little clues we have. You know, diaries. Somebody's wrote a diary. We read that. These little clues that we have, we're putting together a history so we can see the trajectory. We can see what story is this the latest chapter of. Because, you know, if you open a book in the middle and it's a novel and you get to page 30, you know, chapter 37, you're not
Hmm.
going to be able to know what it is. you have to go back and see chapter one to, oh, I see, it's Macbeth, and he's worried about the king and jealousy, and his
Hmm.
wife's got this problem. All right, now I think I'm. So history is our way of situating ourselves in the present to know what is going on here so that we can do something about the future.
Hmm.
Now, when I when I was planning my lectures at the beginning of this year about the invention of tomorrow, one of the things that I went into a great amount of detail about what I thought might happen in the future is I thought, we might see Russia invade Eastern Europe someplace,
Hmm.
probably Ukraine. By
Hmm.
the time I was giving the goddamn lectures, it was happening. So
Right.
the future is something you can't really, you can't, it's
Well, you
just like,
proved your concept, I guess, right? That's
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, there
So, I
was that.
mean, I was going to bring up the war in Ukraine because a lot of what you're touching on and what you focus on in the invention of yesterday is particularly relevant. No, I mean the idea of all of these cultural constellations and this
Yeah,
high degree of subjectivity defining what is effectively reality, and that's
yeah.
sort of driving the Russian perspective, surely, and probably also the Ukrainians to some extent. So, how do you see that its relevance in that situation?
Well, you know what interests me about Russia Ukraine. I mean,
Sure, I
I'm
see what
putting
you're.
it in a
Yeah,
sort of a. I'm horrified by what's happening, and I have my uh, I'm not neutral on this. Uh,
neither am I. I would hope most people are not.
Most people are not, but what is to be noted is that not all the world is on my side on this.
Hmm.
I'm on the Western. I think what Russia is doing is horrible, and I hope Ukraine wins, and I hope
Surely.
this happens without a nuclear war. That's where I stand.
Yeah.
But I'm aware that there's plenty of people who don't think that. And for example, in the Islamic world, many. Um, and as I understand it, India is not ready to uh,
Hmm.
uh, back off on this.
Hmm.
And there is, um, and what I notice is that some of the people, I hear voices here in America too that say, oh, NATO pushed too far and Russia
Hmm.
had to do something. Um, but uh, I noticed that from my point of view, Russia did the same thing in Afghanistan, and they sent 100,000 troops in one night, overnight, and they did that in Ukraine too. And when I saw some of these voices that were saying yes, and Russia was forced to do this, there was mention of Afghanistan, and they oddly enough they said, and they sent 40,000 troops into Afghanistan, and I'm going, wait, that sentence just slides by, but it
Hmm.
wasn't 40,000, it was 100,000, and that makes a difference.
Big
Why
difference.
why reduce the numbers? It makes it seem more uh, incidental or something.
Hmm.
So you know this happened in Russia now, and I don't know where it's going to go. I think the bigger story. Let's get away from Russia Ukraine
Hmm.
and come to. Um, I think that part of the structure of the world that we take for granted, and we take it for granted because it's been that way forever, except it really hasn't been this way forever. What we take for granted is a framework of political reality on planet Earth that says the world is divided into countries. And a country is a patch of land with a border around it, a government inside it that uh, has a currency, an army, and a police force. These are the minimum things about a country. And there's very few parts of the planet Earth that is not actually part of a country. There's a demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. There's that.
Hmm.
There's some questions about, let's say, the Antarctic or something. I'm not sure who
Sure.
owns that.
Hmm.
Um, but basically, any human on Earth can start walking in any direction, and eventually they'll come to a place where they have to have paperwork.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a border, and when they step across that border, might be as much as a few hundred feet, or perhaps even more. But when they get across, then they're in a different country. The rules are different. They have to obey different laws. Blah blah blah. This actually only settled in a couple of hundred years ago.
Hmm.
You know, uh, this system was finalized at the end of World War II. That's not very long ago, and
Hmm.
I think some of this system is starting to dissolve and vanish now, because for the past 50 years or so, 40 or 50 years, there have been uh, the human experience on Earth has been taking place with a disregard for countries and borders. This is the case with multinational corporations eventually became social organisms, social entities that had their own interests, that that were not related to any of the countries in which they were located, and therefore they could decide, I'll put my banking here, I'll put my workforce here, I'll get my minerals here, and I'll do my selling here. And those were all different countries. And so that entity can operate like some social organism, which means it can form intentions, say, okay, now uh, what do I need to do? Then craft a plan, and then take steps, and then do it. So that's an operating thing in the world. Now there is a reality that we all live in, that you and I are in right now. We're not physically in the same space. We're in cyberspace.
Hmm.
And in cyberspace, there is struggling to be born a form of money that has nothing to do with any government, cryptocurrency. Uh, and, you know, when cryptocurrency first appeared on the scene, a guy from the 20th century, such as myself, was like, was was like a caveman looking at this. Like, crypto, I can't what is cryptocurrency?
Hmm.
But then when I thought about it, I realized, a dollar bill is cryptocurrency too. How is that money?
Yeah.
Cryptocurrency is actually an abstraction, or money is an abstraction. Money
Yeah.
is just a whatever mechanisms it takes for people to agree on something called value that is somehow abstracted from any particular thing. It's like, now
Hmm.
that's an amazing that's an amazing thing. It's like, what is the value of a cow as against a lump of gold? They're nothing like each other.
Hmm.
How about a cow and a non-fungible token like
Yeah. Yeah. It's whatever
you know
meaning we ascribe to them, of course.
yeah, and how could those two actually be compared in terms of some single something, which is value? Well, that's money is what does that, and it has taken so many different forms, and it's taking a form now that is mysterious to most people, and mysterious to the people who are using it too, because suddenly it plunges and nobody can do
Yeah,
anything about
exactly.
it.
Hmm.
And I was going to write a book, didn't actually write it, or I did actually write it, but didn't go anywhere with it. But the book was about conspiracy theory,
Hmm.
and my theory is that whenever money is moving to a dramatically different level of abstraction, you're going to see conspiracy theory rising,
Interesting. Yeah.
because conspiracy theory basically says there is some hidden force that is someplace in the world, and this single hidden force is making everything happen, and everything you see is fake because this hidden force is making it happen. And the mysteriousness of money is like that. It's like, when you see that the government does something, you know who does that. It's like the police come and knock on your door. That's the government.
Hmm.
Or they send you a letter and says you owe back taxes, and you know the Department of something or other.
Hmm.
But money, it's like prices go up. Why did prices go up? What's going on? I'm looking at the gas prices here. They, they were saying uh, the barrels of oil, they put the surplus out, and now the oil is cheaper, and so gas prices are cheaper all over the country, but not in California. Here they went up.
Yeah.
Why? Nobody can tell me. Well, money is mysterious that way. So it lends itself to people who say there is somebody doing this, but actually, you know, it's amazing that anything can happen at all. It's like
Yeah,
it,
absolutely.
the idea that somebody's doing this assumes that if somebody weren't doing this, everything would just work out fine.
Yeah,
And no, it wouldn't.
exactly. Yeah. It's a very optimistic take. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting when you really like take a moment to break the because we get so accustomed to just taking it for granted. I mean, very few people have probably taken the time to consider like money really is this arbitrary thing that we've all agreed is valuable and we can use it that way.
Yeah.
But I think there are places where that's great. I mean, we need a currency is obviously a very valuable tool, but there are places to me where the arbitrary nature of it all is definitely a detriment. And one example is something you just alluded to, where there's bizarre pieces of legislation on islands that most people aren't familiar with that just provide all of these amazing financial incentives to the people who are equipped to navigate that environment.
Yeah.
And it's just people take it for granted. Well, though that's how the laws work over there. But why is that conducive to anything that we consider productive at scale? It makes no sense.
But does it in those places that you're thinking of? Is it working? Are they producing?
No, no, I don't believe so. No.
Yeah. Well, in my 20s, it was uh, the age of the counterculture, and I lived
Hmm.
in Portland, Oregon, and uh, you know, uh, I certainly thought, I was kind of like I really had this idea, and I convinced other people it was true.
Uh-huh.
I really thought industrial capitalism was going to collapse and the civilization as we knew it was going to be blown away, and we'd be having to survive in a post apocalyptic landscape. Uh, I bring this up because people are thinking this way again now,
Hmm.
post
Hmm.
apocalyptic landscape. So in my era, because actually things were going pretty well then, we were all like, oh, the apocalypse, but actually everything was running
Things
pretty
were
well.
good.
And we thought we were building an alternative world because we had our own clinics and our own food stores and our own this and that, and we were like, you know, elaborating a barter system where, yeah, I could get the service at the clinic, and mm, I would write an article for them that would appear in the Scribe.
Hmm.
It doesn't work, of course. It's like, nah, you need something that'll
Yeah.
even out all things people do and all things people own that can be measured by one system of value and represented by a token. And in those days, there was uh, um, a little movement that rippled through the counterculture uh, that said, everybody gather at this place in Colorado in the woods, and we'll show the world how a peace-loving community of people, right-minded people, can really live together. And they all, we all went, and there was 30,000 of us that gathered in this place. It was a 10-mile hike from the highway,
Hmm.
and when we got there, it was just the woods, and we were there for 3 days. And in 3 days, crises broke out over water because there was this one little stream, sewage. The place where people were camped were far away from the water, and the herds moving back and forth turned that into a dusty highway.
Hmm.
There were slums developed, and places where the beautiful rich people were camped in their nice
Of
tents.
course. Yeah.
It was like every ill. In 3 days, we reproduced it because we had no system. It doesn't just work by itself.
Hmm. Was that a wake up call to a lot of the people there, including yourself, or how did most people sort of engage with that?
Uh, yeah, well, it wasn't a wake-up call.
I see.
I was asleep for another few years.
I see. I see.
You know, that was in '72 that happened. And that thing was called the Rainbow Family Festival.
Hmm.
It was the first time that happened. I've recently read that Rainbow Family is still holding these gatherings
Really?
in
Wow.
various places.
So somebody had a good
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Somebody had a good time.
yeah. I kind of had a good time, but
Yeah,
you know,
sure, sure.
I, I was aware that the experiment was was proving the opposite of what we wanted to prove.
Hmm.
Um, and but in '74 there was the gas crisis, and it really felt then like the gas was running out, and
Hmm.
the whole civilization was really built on oil. And so we elaborated ideas based on that, and we weren't wrong about that. The oil is going to run out, and
Hmm.
now 50 years later, it's not a different crisis; it's the same crisis.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
you know, we were just saying something should be done, and then you know uh, and actually now something is being done. It's like
Hmm.
I think people are gangbusters going after electrifying things. Uh, the odd thing is we who are sort of consider ourselves to be lefties used to hate nuclear power. We're sort of waking up to no, wait a minute.
Hmm. Yeah.
Maybe it should look at this again. So
I mean, that seems to be one of Europe's main issues is that, especially Germany of all countries. I found it to be a bit surprising that the Green Party had such an influence and was able to really shut. I mean, I think their last plant originally was supposed to already be shut down by now, but
yeah,
I guess it was just Chernobyl and a few of the other more prominent nuclear disasters that just put people off and led to a lot of misinformation about the safety and efficacy
yeah.
of it.
Well, there are safety issues, but
Surely, surely.
there still are. But the safety issue of that we face with fossil fuels is a different one. It's not
Yeah.
Chernobyl; it's the planet.
Yeah, exactly.
And you look at Hurricane Ian in Florida, and now there's another one, and there was one just. This is gonna and where I live now, every summer it's wildfire season,
Hmm.
and so this is happening.
Surely.
Yeah,
It's crazy that it's even necessary to state and try to continue to convince people that
yeah,
this is the situation. It
yeah.
bears itself out pretty clearly.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I wanted to, if you don't mind, I'd love to ask a few more questions about Afghanistan.
Oh
Of
yeah.
course, with everything that's happened. Yeah, so looking for obviously much to the chagrin of most of the world, the Taliban is now in power, and the world has already tried their hand at intervention. I mean, I suppose there are people who are going to always argue that there's some country who has good reason to give it another try, one way or the other. But I think for the most part, we're on the same page that intervention is not a solution. So,
Yeah.
one of the only other solutions is essentially allowing the Taliban to more or less do as they please and expect that the society and government they produce just won't be sustainable, and allow the Afghani people themselves to erect a society that they'll be comfortable with and happy with. But at the same time, by not getting involved to some extent, we're not able to provide aid. We're not able to do some degree of productive action to assure a good outcome for the Afghani people. So, how do you expect would be the best path forward?
Um, you ask an interesting question.
Hmm.
Answer, boy, I really,
Sure.
I'm out of answers here.
Hmm.
Um, I always felt throughout the whole American experiment, there was a 20-year American project there. And when I went there in 2002, right after it was like the Taliban were actually still in the rural areas, the Americans were still fighting them, but they'd been driven out of Kabul. And the optimism of the country was so inspiring in a way. It was the happiest place I'd ever been in a way, and there was a sense there that, the Americans are here, we're safe. and everybody had a plan for something they wanted to do. And everybody I met, they had a little business plan of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
and their business plans were all related to something in their sphere of activity. So it was something they were going to do. And I remember one guy, and that guy, if you put him on TV and showed him, on NBC or something, everybody said that's probably a Taliban, big beard and turban and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
No, the guy was from Wardak, where the Taliban were powerful in Wardak, but he was from Wardak, and he said, "Yes, I have a plan. I'm going to start a cosmetics factory because now that the Taliban are gone, the women are going to want cosmetics, and
Mm-hmm.
this is the way forward." And some other guy, he wanted to do something about the irrigation of his grapes because in the past they were able to sell raisins to Pakistan and eventually to grape nuts had raisins in it or something. There was some, so
Mm-hmm.
everybody had a plan. But what happened was that $1 trillion bundles came falling down on Afghanistan to do really big things. And the really big things ended up being, the people who could handle that money were all the people like sort of like me, I mean, the people who had not the refugees coming back from the camps in Pakistan. Those were Taliban.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they were the exiles who went to Germany and London and America and stuff. And I don't, strictly speaking, I'm not casting blame on these people. They did have these skills. They knew how to operate in a money environment, bureaucratic environment. And America just wanted to go in there and do all the things that are the markers of a successful civil society. They immediately set up having elections, and they had some, uh, you know, uh, they had some um, uh, constitution that was quickly crafted,
Mm-hmm.
and it set up a president, a parliament, all these kinds of apparatus that are the civil apparatus of a democracy in the West. And you know, I said earlier that the thing about a democracy, the thing about thinking of elections as the marker of a democracy is that elections is how we settle what we are going to do. There has to be a we first, though. When there is no we, when there's many different interest groups that see the others as enemies, elections are which interest group is going to is going to
Mm-hmm.
get a hold of the apparatus and beat the other interest groups over the head with it. So that's not democracy. It's like elections is the last step of democracy, not the first. And there has to be some way in which the people have agency so they can actually do things instead of having stuff done to them. If they have stuff done to them, then then they're not in a civil society. So in Afghanistan, Afghans mostly just adapted the way they operate to this election machinery that was what you had to figure out how to maneuver through it so you could get to where piles of money were just flowing
Mm-hmm.
this pipeline and just hitting the ground and splashing. You had to be close there to get some of that money. And those who could get close were the people that later came to be called power brokers,
Mm-hmm.
and they replaced the warlords. The power brokers were able to get money. They hired the warlords then.
Yeah.
They hired
Exactly.
the warlords' armies, and so then a lot of what had happened was happening already. Had just been happening, kept happening. So out in the countryside, throughout the 20 years, there was war going on, and when I went to Afghanistan in 2012, it wasn't safe to just drive from Kabul to Kandahar. There was a great highway, but you couldn't just drive that. Much better to fly because, all along the way on the ground, you had to have protection. Um, Here in America, I feel like the feeling was if there was a war, you never heard about it. You never heard about a battle going on
Hmm.
there. And in the Obama days, then it became drone warfare. So then it was just drones going out doing this stuff and bombing, killing. There was like 50,000 drone uh, attacks during that time, and I don't think anybody ever really heard anything about that.
No.
So when there came a time, and when I was in 2012, when I went there, I met some people who were in the army and a few who were in the police. These guys were not soldiers and they were not policemen. They were tough guys, but they were not soldiers because they was it was a job. And when it came time to actually, risk their lives for something, what for these guys who are just incredibly rich because
Yeah.
they got close to the money, I'm not going to risk my life for that guy.
Hmm.
Many of them, their their cultural values were very similar to the Taliban. They were not that against it. And in terms of like the role of women, I was with some guy and I was close enough that there was family relationships. I was able to be in the house and dining with the family. We're all sitting on the floor around the tablecloth. His wife was there. His kids were there. I was there. He was there. And he said to me, Tamim, I think I'm going to get me another wife. Um, and and his wife was there, and she said, if you get another wife, I'm picking her, first of all. And second of all, she gets that upstairs area. There's a two-story house. This downstairs here's mine. So this is a different world. This is not the world that
Yeah.
I live in here. Um, and that's the people who are in the army and the police force. When the when the withdrawal time came, of course the Taliban poured in. There was no army to protect anybody. And the people in the city who had grown up in the American project, that many were born in the 90s or later, they were now 20s and 30s. Kabul was probably 10 million people. That's a huge city. And they were modern. They lived in a modern world. They had, you know, art, and music, and theater, and movies, and cafes, and so on. Um, but they were not going to fight for that. They were going to get on those cargo planes and get the hell out of
Hmm.
there. So the only people who were really, in fighting trim and ready to pick up the guns were these guys from the rural areas. They came
Hmm.
storming in. They're not going to last, I don't think.
No, I don't
I
either.
I think Afghanistan wants to, the impulse within the country that wants to be part of the world goes back to that thing I told you before, the satellite dish in a mud village clinging to a hillside that took 8 hours of driving and then another three on no roads to get to. Those people know what the world is. That energy is there. Even if they keep, if they put the soldiers on the streets and make the women stay indoors, they're going to hear about, uh, they're going to interact with the world. That will change, but not right away. You
Sure.
know,
Well, one thing that sort of scares me a little bit is China's seeming interest because they seem like they might be a means of giving people enough of the rest of the world, but at the same time facilitating the Taliban's regime.
yeah, I think China's the next one that's going to try.
Yeah.
And China has a way of doing this,
Yes.
in my opinion. It's like
Hmm.
when I look at Chinese history, I see that they're not very much into invading.
No.
They don't send out armies and conquer places. Um, they have a way of extending their Chineseness over an area. Then once it's part of China, that's when the steel hand within the velvet glove comes off. So
Hmm.
when they come to Afghanistan, they're going to come offering aid. They're not going to interfere with social interactions. Men want to keep their women indoors. They're going to let that. None of their business. They're not going to interfere with Islam. They're going to build, the infrastructure. They're already building a highway from
Hmm.
China through the Wakhan corridor to Kabul. It's a terrain that would have seemed impossible to build a highway down that, but I bet they're gonna do it fast, and it'll be a good highway because
Hmm.
that's what China is good at. Once they've got it, then it'll be Xinjiang. It's like it'll be the Turkish minority
Hmm.
and in the far provinces. Then then the Afghans will discover that they shouldn't have done this.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but they might fight anyhow. I don't know. Afghanistan.
Yeah. Sure.
Afghanistan is a pretty. I gotta say, I feel like Afghanistan is a really pretty special place. My
Surely.
heart
Surely.
my heart is can't detach from dear Afghanistan.
Well, I think that's a good thing. I certainly think that's a good thing. Do you think? I mean, how do you imagine that the Taliban will be willing to cooperate with China, knowing everything with the Uyghurs? Because you think that they might take issue with that. No, I mean, there still
Well,
is some sense of. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
there is a China. There was a meeting between Taliban high officials in
Yeah.
China, and
Hmm.
they did announce that the Uyghurs is internal affairs of China. We respect them.
Wow.
They
Really?
did make that statement. But one thing that has to be tossed into the equation here is I don't think it's that definite as to who the Taliban are or what this government is.
Hmm.
Um, there are different Taliban. Um, there are some of these Taliban that some people suspect, and I'm in no position to say it isn't so, that are still being listed as top Taliban, maybe even the Taliban rulers who
Hmm.
might actually not be alive anymore. They might have gotten rid of some of these guys.
Really?
Um, and there's some distinct sets. There's one bunch of people that are the Haqqani network, and that's basically like a tribal criminal organization that comes from the northwest frontier province area of Pakistan, straddles that border, and uh, they've been into the smuggling business, the drug business, the arms dealing business, and stuff. So they're tough in that way. And then there's these ones that used to be called the Quetta Shura, the Parliament of Quetta, and
Hmm.
they're like the remnants of the original Taliban, who were youngsters that came out of the camps in Pakistan. That's a different bunch of guys. I think there's more hope for those guys. The
Hmm.
truth. Um, and But they were kind of a creation of the Pakistan Secret Service, Inter-Services Intelligence, which is Pakistan CIA.
Hmm.
So they were created by that group as their instrument by which they were hoping to gain control of Afghanistan so they could control this alleged pipeline they hope would come down through Afghanistan to Pakistan. That didn't happen. Um, then there is like the Islamist jihadists from outside, from the Arab world, and some of this ISIS K business, I think, might be connections going out to the internationalist, revolutionary Islamist kind of world.
Hmm.
That's where the Al Qaeda kind of energy is now in
Hmm.
this group. Um, we don't hear much about some actual structure of government inside of Kabul.
Hmm.
Um, one thing we do know is that, for example, Karzai is still there, and he's nobody's bothering Karzai. Karzai has got a lot of power in Kabul, I've heard.
Hmm.
Uh, and where does he get his power? Well, he's got connections. Who's he got connections to? People say he's Russia's man in Afghanistan. I don't know.
Sure, sure.
Maybe
Hmm.
people will say every kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But he's hanging
Well,
on. He wants to be there.
I mean,
So
we'll see. Well, I mean, it goes back to the problem I guess I've had since the beginning of time, which is just that they're in the best and worst place in so many ways in the world, and it seems like many Afghanistan's issues may never be fully resolved until everyone around them resolves their own issues and leaves them alone. And
yeah, well, Afghanistan's issue from the fact that it's right between big power blocks that are culturally different. You know,
hmm
it's right between the Turkish world up there, the Indian world down there, the Iranian world over there,
hmm
the Chinese world over there, and then the Turkish world became the Russian world, and
yeah,
then there was the American. So it's like right in between all that stuff,
exactly.
and there's no way it's not gonna be that place until those other cultural places cease to exist as competing powers like that.
hmm
And then the question comes up: can civilizations quit being competing powers where they overlap? It's like that's the question of the next age.
Yeah, sort of touches on the entire conversation, but it seems like the missing link really is just getting on the same page. I mean, whether it's about what has actually happened in the past and reporting all the right facts and agreeing upon a vision for the future. Because
Yeah,
for me, what's one of the most frustrating things is we have the tools with sufficient cooperation to
yeah,
create a world so amazing compared to what we have even now that
yeah,
it would be just beyond what most people would imagine is possible. And the only thing that we don't have is a high enough degree of cooperation.
yeah. And what we need for that cooperation is is a global human self. You know,
Hmm
we think of people cooperating in a mechanistic way because we're humans and we do things with tools. So we're
hmm
trying to find the tools with which to. But uh, when you think about the personality of an individual person, um, you know, an individual person is not this structure of bones and meat that's sitting here. You see an image of it up there.
hmm
that's
Yeah.
that's attached to the person that I am. But the person that I am is actually this constellation. This is what I'm trying to get at in in the invention of yesterday. Is this constellation of memories, ideas, you know, um, history, attitudes, blah blah blah, and and by being a person, all of that stuff somehow is one. It's coherent. It's me. It's what I see. It's the world I live in. But there's other people in there. You're there. My friends out there. I completely believe and know that you're a conscious being just like me. And we're not machines. We're an organism in the world. And I think that groups of us can become like social organisms and that we can have group intentions that are those of a larger self that we're part of. And in our cultures, all cultures have some strain of celebration for being bigger than yourself. It's like being part of, like doing it for your country, doing it for your
hmm
family, stepping up for your friends. It's like there is that ethos that every culture has some version of it. And I think if we could think of cultures as personalities, you know, that culture is what a group has in the way that personality is what an
hmm
individual human animal has. Um, we can begin to get to a place where different cultures are like different organs in an organism. The lungs don't try to become like the kidneys.
Sure. Yeah,
I hope.
absolutely.
The blood does what the blood does. They're all
hmm
part of the same system, and they're contributing to the good of the whole self. but they got their own fish to fry.
No,
They're doing their own
absolutely.
kind of thing. I think the whole human self could be like that, but we need the narrative to make it
No,
work.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's a good place to leave off on a very on a
Okay.
positive note. And I don't want to take too much of your time, but
Well,
really, it's
thank
been
you.
an absolute pleasure. It's really, really an honor to get the chance to speak with you. So thank you.